Welcome to the Building Better Software Teams podcast, where we help technologists in all roles gain influence, expertise, and advancement through team building and thought leadership. From tech stack to team culture, we dig into everything and anything that can help you and your team achieve success. And now your host, Mark Schneider.
Thank you for joining us on the Building Better Software Teams podcast. Today with us we have Ernie Miller, who is the Director of Application Engineering at Fastly. And he's also given several talks, one of which I'm a huge fan of, which is stating the obvious. So Ernie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. I'm really excited to be here and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
Awesome. So let's get started with, tell us a little bit about maybe like your current role and how you got there. What was your journey to Director of Application Engineering?
Sure. Gosh, I don't know where to start on that. Let's see. So I think a while back I had decided that something that I needed in order to sort of be fueled properly or nourished properly as a leader was really clear purpose and values alignment from my company and its leadership. And one of the things that really stood out to me as I was interviewing for my current position was just how much the values of the company shone through even in the interview process. And it wasn't one of those things where it's like, oh, we're looking for a culture fit, because I think culture fits are problematic. Culture ads are cool. I always think about expanding the Venn diagram. There's certain things, though, that are core values. For instance, one of our values is transparency. And it's so very cool to see that even during the interview process, people were being transparent. It wasn't sort of like, let's just tell people pretty little lies they'd like to hear to get them in the door. And then fooled you. Yeah. I really appreciated that.
So there was a sense of safety.
Absolutely. It started out that way. It started out with the sense of safety. And I think that's such a critical thing for leadership to provide. And so it's one of those things that stood out to me during the interview process. The teams that I'm currently responsible for are about 28 people, 4 different teams that are responsible in large part for the API and UI surface area of Fastly. And so I like to think of it, and in fact, one of the things that I told our team is, we're responsible for the tactile experience. There's so many things, when you work for a tech company, that deep down beneath the surface, something goes wrong, people notice. But if it's working great, nobody notices. But, for something like this, you have this opportunity to make a really positive first impression. A lot of our customers are API or UI engineers, after all, and so they have probably ideas about how an API or a UI should work. So it's a really neat place to be. And again, you notice I say, this is kind of who we are. This is what we are. That building team identity thing is so incredibly important from a leadership perspective, I think.
Mm-hmm. So what you focus on is a lot of API development. Are you doing like user experience or UI development as well, or is it pretty much okay? Mm-hmm. So the whole
we're responsible for that. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're touching the Fastly experience in some way, you're likely working through something that one of our teams has put together.
What got you into technology?
When I was 5 years old, my parents, and this is going to date me, my parents bought an Atari 2600 for us for Christmas. When I was 6 year old, we got a TRS-80 Color Computer 2, Coco 2, or Trash 80, whatever you want to call it, right? And that was so I'm 6 years old, and I put 2 and 2 together. I'm like, oh, people use these to make these? That's what I want to do when I grow up. Mm-hmm. And so I initially got interested in programming because I wanted to make video games. Which, now that I think about it, is kind of funny, because realistically, you're just creating an experience for people when you're making video games, too. It's ultimately, there's different sides of the same coin. The value that you create in a software team is the experience that someone else has of the software you build, at least for most things that aren't just simply, your personal projects or whatever. So understanding that the whole point of it is to provide value to someone, and kind of getting yourself into that headspace of who is that person that I'm trying to provide value for is really core to building software. And I guess then, moving from that, I actually, got my start working tech support for an ISP. I am a filthy college dropout. I was a CS major, and about a year into that major, I realized I was going into debt. And, I grew up in a family without a lot of money, and debt was something that was terrifying to me. And I realized in the CS program, I was learning theory, but I was much more interested in the practical application of the skills. Mm-hmm. Now, I took a couple semesters of Japanese. I took some philosophy courses that were cool, and I enjoyed some of that. But I'm thinking to myself this whole time, I'm going into such debt right now for what? And so I took a chance, and I started working as a tech support representative for an ISP. And the goal was to eventually move into systems administration and work my way into software development professionally that way. I knew I wanted to be in tech at the very least, and this was my foot in the door, so to speak. So I put in that time, and thankfully, did a good job and had an opportunity arise that I was able to step into that role. I always tell people now, don't do what I did, stay in school, kids. But I mean, there is a certain amount of, it would be irresponsible of me, I think, to talk about this and talk about my experience without saying, look, I'm a white male in tech, which afforded me certain privilege that I look at now as an opportunity to wield for good for folks who are underrepresented in our industry.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny. I have a similar story. Is I also am a college dropout, and I also worked at a internet service provider for about a year before I transitioned to a system administrator / developer role. But you're absolutely right. Given that my background and connections and things like that, that's what allowed me to make that jump. I feel like others who aren't in that situation would have struggled and potentially never been able to make it to that. So totally with you on that.
Sure. Your listeners can't see you, but you look like an engineer, quote unquote, look like an engineer.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. Right. And they they've seen me. I've got my picture out of it. So everybody knows I'm an engineer. I don't think there's anybody who will ever mistake me for anything other than that. So then you kind of transitioned from technical support, and sounds like you eventually got into software engineering to some extent, right? Mm-hmm. What made you decide that you wanted to transition from individual contributor to manager? How did you kind of know that that's the path you wanted to take, and what did that look like?
Well, so many of the best folks I've had the opportunity to work with, when you start asking them what is it they're aiming to do in their job, many of them will say something like, I want to have an impact, or I want to make a difference, or I want to do something valuable, or whatever, right? One of the things that I realized is that most of the software development work that I was doing, I was getting the most joy out of watching the impact that it had on people. For instance, some of the tools teams that I worked on, I did a lot of internal tools development at various points in my career. And it's an extremely satisfying cycle to go through because you're so close to the end user. Some cases you are the end user. And so you have that very tight feedback loop where you don't even necessarily it's like cheating, right? Because you were so close to them that it's so easy to have the empathy for the user and to understand sort of what they want. And so I realized, the impact that I'm having is all people-based, really. That's where you're making a dent. In one of the talks I gave, I've mentioned in the past that, people are the important part of the universe. And so when we talk about making a dent in the universe, it's really making an impact on people. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought that software is really just an abstraction layer between me and the people I want to make a difference for. Mm-hmm. And so I got to thinking, well, how do I scale my impact? Well, I can start dealing directly with people. And those people can want to have an impact on other people and so forth and so on. And that's led to things like, hey, maybe I should do some conference speaking. Maybe I should become a team lead. Maybe I should get into management. Or it's about having an increasing impact on the people.
Kind of driving it back to what you said originally, what your ability to create an experience for people, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's weird because I think a lot of people in our industry would classify myself as an introvert, and yet people that know me would say, "Oh, there's no way you're an introvert. Like, you don't understand how drained I am by the time I get done dealing with people all day long." Yeah. But ultimately, I love people. I think the pinned tweet that I have right now on my Twitter profile is something to the effect of, if I die and people say that I love people and wanted them to know that they're worthy, then that'll be good enough. You know, like ultimately, that's how you leave a mark in the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny because I think engineers sometimes think that they can leave their mark by creating the next greatest architecture, the next greatest piece of software, and you certainly can take pride in that, no doubt. Mm-hmm. But I'm with you. I think the long term, like the things that really matter, are how you influence others, how you whether that be coaching, mentorship, or just daily interaction, helping other people, learning from other people. Like how you interact with other people is the real, true, long-term, thing that you're creating. And I think once engineers figure that out, they can still do all that really cool engineering stuff and build all those really cool systems. But then on top of that, you can do that with others. And I've even found too that when you build something with others, you create that end deliverable, which is great, but you also build trust, you build, relationships, and that's really cool too, so. Mm-hmm.
There are so many times, and I've had this conversation multiple times over the past week, so much that it's now becoming a theme in my thinking, that so much of what we do as leaders is, we have this context, right? In an ideal world, we have context that our teams need in order to feel a connection to the purpose and significance of the work that they're doing. And that's certainly one key thing that I think every engineer that is very driven is going to want to know. Like, why is what I'm doing important? Mm-hmm. And why does it matter? And so we have that context. And it's so easy. And in fact, I've seen so many leaders get tripped up where it's like, I have all this context and I must, disseminate it to the masses and be this font of wisdom. And yet, we all just have this little meat sack in our head, surrounded by a shield of bone. And the only way that we can share the context that exists there is through our words, through our writing, through, interacting with other people. And it occurs to me that the best leaders that I've had a chance to work with don't forget that everyone else has that same little meat sack that is full of information, and they might have context too. Yep. So another one of our team values is curiosity, right? Having a curious spirit. And I think it's so incredibly important to bring that curiosity to every interaction. For instance, if you're a new leader on a team, don't walk into every meeting that you're meeting with your folks thinking, I have a plan. Like, let me tell you my plan. Yeah. But rather say, I am taking on the role of archaeologist here. I am looking at our code and I have questions. Mm-hmm. But I know that folks were acting with good intent, and I know that folks were doing the best they could at the time, and that's certainly a worldview thing. Not everybody believes that, but I'd like to think that everyone is doing the best they can with what they have at the moment. And so if I come in from that mindset, then I can say, what am I not seeing? Why did we get to where we are? Can you talk me through it? So maybe a team might have a reputation for moving slowly, for instance, and it's certainly a reasonable thing to say, well, yeah, they seem to move slowly, but maybe there's context I'm missing. Why are they moving slowly? There's this old movie at this point. It's based on a book called The Never-Ending Story. Are you familiar with it?
I am not.
Okay. So there's this scene in this movie where, and it's for kids. It's got Jim Henson, like animatronics and puppets and stuff. Like it's I highly recommend it. I'm sorry. Yes,
I'm a big Muppets fan, so now I'm going to have to go check that out.
Yeah. So The Never-Ending Story. And so there's a main character named Atreyu, and he has a horse named Artax. And they're going through this bog, this swamp, where the sadder you get, the more you sink, right? And so many of our code base, like, think about it. isn't that sort of how it feels sometimes? It's like we're just getting deeper and deeper, and it's getting messier and messier. And this is not even fun to work on anymore. So now I just want to do the quickest possible thing to get to the next, to the next ticket or to the next whatever.
Because it's too painful to do the right thing, right?
Right. And so, I think about that scene in that movie a lot. It's a very sad scene. Not to spoil a 80s movie at this point, but Artax dies in the bog in the swamp because Artax is sad. Yeah. And I guess to bring it back to the people thing, so much of what we're doing is cheerleading for our team and reminding them why what they do matters, so they can bring their best parts of themselves to these kinds of problems. To dig out of that sort of pit of despair.
And no, you're absolutely right. And in order for that to happen, in order for us to understand what those problems are, it takes us listening, right? We have to like you said, you can't walk in there and say, here's the plan, make it happen. You need to walk in there, take the time to understand what challenges the team is currently facing. And I do believe you can form a strategy with that in mind. So you take those inputs, you take the inputs from what your team is dealing with, you take the inputs from what upper management is looking to accomplish, and try to figure out how do we reconcile those things without just trying to force it upon the team. I also think something you said was really interesting is that people do their best. We have to believe that people are doing their best. And I totally agree with that, because I think a lot of times what's happening is folks are trying to do their best, but they either don't know what to shoot for, so that it hasn't been made clear to them, like, these are the objectives, this is what's important, this is what isn't important. And then secondly, what you said is, like, folks might not understand the situation that team is in, and they might not understand why they can't accomplish certain things. And the good news is, I think there's solutions to those problems, but it just takes time, and you have to value the people, because the people are the ones that are going to tell you what those problems are. And if they don't trust you, going back to the trust thing, if they don't trust you, they might not even be honest with you. I know I've been in a situation where I've been stuck in something, and I've looked at it and I said, this is something I can't figure out. I'm embarrassed about that, and I don't want to tell anybody that I can't figure that out. And that's until you trust the person that you're reporting to, or as a coach and a mentor, you're not going to be inclined to share that type of information.
Can I dive into that for just a
second?
Yeah,
absolutely.
What you just said is so important, and I have literally this happened yesterday, so it's very fresh in my mind at this point. So yesterday, I have a team member who is currently in Austin, Texas. I love my team. I care very much about each and every one of them. And in fact, one of my statements about who I am as a manager is that as a manager, I hope to help you do the best work of your career. And as a person, I love you. And those two things are sort of core to my philosophy overall around, how to lead. And so there are times when I don't always do the things that I should do, or the best possible way to maybe address something. What I'm trying to get at is, I had a person in Austin, Texas, who was struggling. I mean, the situation in Texas. As we're recording this, it's February 20th right now. So this previous week has been apocalyptic for many people in Texas, frankly. Mm-hmm. And one of the members of my team, I was telling myself at the time that I was just trying to stay out of their hair, right? Just to let them focus on what they needed to focus on. I knew it was going to be a bad week for them. But I was also dealing with a lot of other distractions in the week. And I didn't reach out to them after the week got kind of kicked off proactively to say, hey, are you doing okay? What is there anything you need? Mm-hmm. Do you want me to just check in on your team and make sure that everything's fine? Is there something I can specifically be doing to help you? And I reached out to them yesterday and I said, hey, I've been trying to stay out of your hair. I hope everything's going well, and that you're getting back to some sense of normalcy. And they said to me, honestly, I would have appreciated somebody reaching out sooner, or I would have appreciated you specifically reaching out sooner. And I was like, oh man, I screwed up. Mm-hmm. I screwed up. And you have to have this kind of hard conversation with yourself at that point, saying like, well, did I, in this particular situation, am I being honest with myself? Is it just staying out of their hair, or was I also distracted with my own crap, right? Mm-hmm. And that's difficult. That's hard work to do as a person, certainly as a leader. And the feedback that I got from this person was only enabled because we had built this bridge of trust over time, where they knew it was safe to tell me that.
Yeah.
And so I go back, we have a shared manager channel, and I go back to the manager channel and say, hey, I did something dumb. Like, maybe check up on your people, on your team, right? If you don't know how bad it is right now in Texas, this is what you need to be doing. And I had another manager reach out to me at the time saying something to the effect of, this was great. I'm so fortunate that that I get to work with you and see this sort of thing modeled. And I go, look, and here's sort of the big secret. This mostly comes from not being afraid to say, oh, hey folks, look at this stupid thing I just did.
Yeah.
And if you can enable in your teams the ability to say, oh, hey, folks, look at this stupid thing I just did, then you're doing all right. Yeah. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that is such a key component.
It's scary because you don't know how people will perceive you, right? But I think what you need to realize is by opening yourself up and sharing those types of things, you're basically saying, hey, I'm human too. I get it. Help me get better. It's not your job. You're not accountable to help me get better. You're not my coach, but I need your input. Kind of going back to what we were saying before, is we need input from you. One of the things I've been trying to do during status updates is forcing folks to give me information that's not good. Tell me something you're not happy about. If it's about me, that's even better. And I'm not encouraging you to necessarily beat me up all the time. That's not what I'm looking for. What I want to know is, where can we get better? Like, how can I make this an environment where you're happier and more productive? And that means you have to be honest with me about things that aren't. And it doesn't even have to be, technology related. It doesn't need to be process related. It doesn't need to be. It could just be simply about our relationship, our interaction. What could I be doing better?
Yeah. So I actually tell my team members, anybody that I'm in a one-on-one with, even if it's a skip level or whatever, I say, hey, what have I screwed up lately? That's how I frame it. Yeah. And I say lately because, if we just let you go back to the dawn of time, then we'll never get done here. But I know I might make mistakes. Yeah. And some folks are like, I wish you wouldn't say it that way. That's so self-deprecating. And and to me, it's just look, you've got to make it okay. You've got to say, okay, look, I'll throw the first punch at myself. I know I'm not perfect, and it has to be from a place of authenticity. And they're only going to see that if you're not really looking for it. Yeah, you're right.
If
that's theater, it's nah. Yeah. But I get such good feedback that way. I mean, it's easy to tell the boss something you're happy about. Yeah, it's really, really risky to tell the boss something that you find problematic.
Yep. And I don't blame folks for having that feeling, because some people will not accept that type of feedback. So it's up to you to be I think going back to what your story originally, it's about us being proactive. That really hits home what you just said about with Texas, because I do that too, where I'll say, I'm going to leave them alone. I'm going to give them their space. And what I'm essentially saying is, I'm not going to worry about that. And the space thing's okay. That's important, but you also can't tell yourself, I'm just going to completely ignore that situation. And there's a way of looking at that where you have to say, I'm still going to be proactive. I'm still going to be engaged, but I'm still going to give space. And that's not an easy thing to do. Right. So.
Yeah. And the lesson I learned was that it's really almost never a bad idea to reach out to someone with love and concern. Yeah. They're going to be able to, people have a radar for that sort of thing. They know when it's legit. They know when you actually care versus this is the motion that I know I need to perform right now. And that's so important. When I think about leaders, there are leaders that are very optics focused. What is the appearance that I'm giving off right now? Mm-hmm. And then there are leaders that actually don't give a crap about optics. This is going to look bad, but you know what? It's more important to do the hard thing right now. Yeah. The optics thing has been a touch point for me a lot lately. I'm seeing it a lot in various leaders around the industry right now, where it's I have to project, this air of confidence that I know where we're going and all of that. And I get why, it's important to think, well, my leader has a plan or has some idea or a plan for a plan, but also one of the most sort of trust increasing conversations I can have with anyone I report to anywhere in my career is when they say, you know, I don't know. Let's talk that through.
Yeah.
Let's figure out what's next. I don't know. Because it invites someone else into the problem solving. It doesn't concentrate all the decision making in one place, but it says, hey, other people have wisdom too, and maybe they have ideas I haven't thought about, because it goes back to that whole, I've just got what's in this little meat sack bouncing around inside my cranium.
You are listening to the Building Better Software Teams podcast. For more info about this podcast, including episode notes, visit 7samurai.dev.
Hey everybody, a couple of shout outs in this episode. The first one I want to mention some great resources that I've discovered in the last week or so. One of them is follow up with Rick Levanos, who was a guest on our show last episode. He's recently launched a newsletter entitled The Rising Dev, and it's focused on helping folks who are just kind of up and coming in their development careers. Great article about domain knowledge and how it can help you differentiate. And he cites a statistic which is pretty interesting, and that's 24 million developers currently out there in the field. And the funny thing is, there's still a demand for that for developers as well. But with that said, 24 million developers out there, and he says differentiation is critical, and I would 100% agree with that. So what he did was he kind of laid out an article that talks a little bit about why domain knowledge is important, how you can obtain it, and how you can utilize it. And one of the examples he gave was, he has extensive experience in the e-commerce industry, so he's become very familiar with PCI compliance and some of those things. And he just talks a little bit about how that's really been a benefit for him in his career. So great article. I'd encourage everybody to go check it out. The Rising Dev. It's a newsletter. You'll receive regular updates and additional information from him. Or just a really great resource. The second one that I want to bring up is Perry 2 has a podcast called Podcast Ruined by a Software Engineer, and I love that title. Great title. He just put out his latest episode 19, with Dan Moore, who's the head of developer relations at FusionAuth. Covers some really great topics such as how to grow a tech community, how to publish a book, just some overall general great conversation. Perry always puts out a fantastic product, so I'd highly recommend that. The third is Camille Fournier. Some of you may know as the author of The Manager's Path. She put out a blog post about making boring plans, which I thought was just excellent. And it's in the context of large platform teams and how they need to manage innovation and stability and kind of balance those two things, which I think is a great call out. It's just that's just the day-to-day battle, I think, with running any type of engineering team, is how do you manage the need for innovation and the need for the company that you work for to move forward and creating stability and reducing risk. And she referenced an older article, but put kind of a new spin on it. It talks about this concept of innovation tokens, which I thought was a really great way of thinking about innovation and how it affects a team. And the concept is really that all innovation comes with a cost associated with it, and you have a set number of innovation tokens that you can spend in a given time without completely disrupting the stability of a team. One of the things she really covers it well, which is this concept of vision and strategy and how they're not the same thing. I think she did a great job of explaining that, vision comes down to a team, but it's up to the technologists and the leaders on that team to form a strategy around that vision to ensure that it's being done in a way that's consistent and stable, that innovation can happen without disrupting existing services or potentially disrupting other projects and things like that. So it's just a great article. I encourage everybody to go read it. My take on it too is that it doesn't just apply to platform teams. That's the context she kind of put that in. But I'd say that can even apply to an organization that's trying to take on a large amount of innovation, thinking about it in terms of let's be strategic and let's take on this innovation in a way that actually makes sense. So great resource. And then the last thing I'll bring up real quick is Jason Von Ruden, Wisconsin.net user group, also a past guest on this show. Recently, they did a event over there called Event Driven Architectures on Azure with Dustin Ewers. Great great talk. Where I work, we use Azure event-driven architecture pretty heavily. And some of it I kind of knew, but there were some other interesting things that they kind of brought up in that meeting, addressing some of the common problems, such as they call it the thundering herd problem. So if you've built event-driven technology, you have a lot of worker processes subscribing to those events. How do you deal with the fact that you have, a large number of subscribers that are going to be reacting to, one or two events here and there? So talking through that, discussing what to do with common problems such as event delivery failures, things like that. One of the really interesting things he does is he goes to the difference between Azure Event Grid, Event Hub, and Service Bus. And where I work, we're heavy consumers of Service Bus. I wasn't real familiar with some of those other services that Azure provides. So it was a really great talk. Finally, he goes through and he sets up an example of an app with Service Bus, which I think is pretty beneficial for any organization that's just getting into that to take a look at, to kind of see what the mechanics of that looks like. We recently, like I said, where I work, we made the transition, and I'd say over the last year and a half, to event-driven technology or event-driven architecture. And the payoffs have been there. The ROI on that has been great. It's allowed us to be more flexible. We can scale things like that. But with that said, it's a different mindset. So great talk. I highly recommend it. So I will take all of these and I will put links to these on the podcast notes as well, in addition to anything that Ernie's mentioned in his interview. And we'll make sure we get all that listed. So if you're interested, come check us out at 7samurai.dev. You'll see this podcast and you'll be able to see all of the links to these different resources. So thanks for listening, and we'll get back to the interview with Ernie. What I feel like you need to do, this is my opinion, is you come in there with ideas. Because I think that's what people need is starting points. They don't look to us to solve everything for them, but they look to us to provide ideas that we can start to solution together, as you said, and make it a collaborative process.
And the big risk as a manager, especially in a very technical company, is that we can say, I really want to get into the weeds a little bit with the team and get into the trenches and whatever. But oftentimes we underestimate just how loud our voice is if we show up in those situations that way. And it is so much more important. I've been thinking a lot about how people say they're results driven. And I think that's a crappy framing. I would rather say I'd like to drive results than be results driven. And I know that seems like splitting hairs. Oh, is that just semantics? But where is the focus if you say you're driving results? It's on the people doing the things. Whereas if you say results driven, it's almost like, okay, we took some measurements. They've now caused us like a Venus flytrap to react, to snap shut or whatever, to do this thing because the results have told us this. Mm-hmm. It's not that you don't measure. The measurement's important to know you're getting better, but this is just good science. You need a hypothesis first to test. You need to say, I think this will help. And to give a practical example of how this kind of thing shows up in management even, I had previously redone an on-call rotation or expanded an on-call rotation for a previous employer. And so I knew sort of how this should work in my head. And one of the things that's crucial to something like that is you want to set people up for success. You want to give them run books so they know what to do when they get paged, and so that they know who they can turn to when they run out of ideas. And all of these things are very, very important. But they come from a why. The bigger why is, we care about each other and we want to set each other up to succeed. And the why and that sort of the drive, the thing that is driving, is so much more important than whatever the end result is in some cases. Because if you get the driving part right, the results are natural side effects. They're side effects isn't fair because they are an intended effect. They are direct effects of this causative action. So next job that I had, I ran into the same situation. We had a 3-person on-call rotation. We had expanded the team dramatically. I wanted to expand the on-call rotation. And so I said, hey folks, this is important. We care about the success of our people that we roll in. And so what I want to have is this on-call rotation. As soon as we have run books ready, even if they're just a skeleton of run books, we're good enough to go. We'll, roll with those and we'll flesh them out as we go. But we need to do that first. And I was really explicit about that. But I went on vacation And I came back, and in our next staff meeting, the team were talking about the expanded on-call rotation. I'm like, oh, that happened. Okay, so we have run books. And they're like, no, we don't have run books. And one of the longtime engineers on the team had said, it was me. I'm the one that added the people. If you're going to be upset. And I said, well, and that was my instinct, right? My instinct was I was so explicit about what we needed to do. And I said, somehow, luckily, through some twist of fate, maybe it was because I came back fresh from vacation. I don't know. I stopped and I caught myself and I got back to the curious place and said, okay, so tell me, how did we get here? What was going on here? And I'd really love to hear from the people that have been rolled out into this rotation, because I do want them to feel set up for success. And one of the very experienced engineers who had recently joined the team said, I don't feel like I know what I'm doing yet to get into an on-call rotation. But we've had the same 3 people on call for so long, and I don't want them to be the only ones that are carrying the burden. And that's when I was like, oh, crap. They got the bigger why. Yeah. They care about each other. They want to show up. That's the more important part. That's the important part. So let's roll with this and see what happens. And it turned out to be, in some ways, a disaster, right? That next week that he rolled into on-call, he was paged almost every night. He was being woken up at all hours. But what happened was 2 of the 3 people that had previously been on the on-call rotation showed up for him in a huge way, in that they started digging in and solving root cause while he was doing the mitigating of the problem. Mm-hmm. And they did that because they cared about him. He showed up for them. And where they would have probably just weathered that storm because they're just used to it, when they saw someone else being hurt by this, situation, they dug into the root cause and fixed it, made it better,
and
reduced the pages.
And it was somebody who chose to do that to help them. I'm sure they understood that, right?
Right. And so long story short, that was one of the happiest surprises of, my career. Just sort of saying, hey, I had an idea, but the deeper why part is really what matters. And being able to let go of my own preconceived notion of what the solution had to look like. Yeah. And get into that more creative space with the team yielded a much better result. And I still remember the write-up after that week of, we did a postmortem or an incident learning report, we would call them. And it said one of the learnings, I don't like nounifying that, but one of the learnings was we show up for each other. And I just love that. Yeah. That was where, you get a team, start to really form an identity. Yeah. This is who we are. This is how we work, right? That's where the satisfying work shows up.
That's really, really cool. You see a team that kind of works independently. A lot of members work independently, and there is kind of a common purpose there, but they're still kind of in their silos. And then there's that moment where they all have to kind of bond together to try to solve some sort of problem. And then you just see the team gel and start to trust each other. And I think one of the coolest things to see with the team is when they start to understand the different roles and the different perspectives, and they start to place value upon those. And they'll go to somebody and say, hey, I know you know this system really well. Tell me more about it so that I can do my job, versus, just trying to figure it out. And I guess what's really cool about that is, as leaders, that's where we succeed then. If we can cultivate that, we'll start to see those teams producing effectively and efficiently. So going back to what you had said before, when you have a team that's slow, I think a lot of times it's slow because A, like we said, it's not understood what their challenges and problems are. And B, there might be some trust issues, or there might be some team dynamic that needs to be solved, and seeing that type of thing get corrected. And to your point, even and self-organizing is the key, right? When it's getting to the point where we're not having to push it, it's just happening. That is so cool to see. That's almost like you go back to engineering equivalence in engineering. It's almost like you build your system, and all of a sudden it starts doing things, and it's kind of handling things. You're not having to babysit anymore. That I look at teams the same way. When you can build a team that can do that, and you can just be hands off to some extent, that's pretty awesome. So that's a cool story. You told me that before, and that's still stuck in my head. I think, and the funny thing too is, I think support is almost always one of those problems where the team has to bond together, because people can't be on support 24/7. So you're forced to kind of have people take on roles and responsibilities they're not comfortable with during those after hours, and they have to trust each other. So it's also why I'm completely against dedicated support teams. I love flowing my support through the work stream teams and forcing them to kind of support their own stuff because I feel like that there's team bonding opportunities there, and it kind of puts them all on the same page. So
it should show up in, I think, supportability in general, and the approach to making sure that there are like run books around and like documentation in place and et cetera. That's all part of the definition of done.
Yep.
Of any given work, right? It's not done until it's supportable.
Yeah.
There's a couple of books that I'm thinking about right now as we've been talking, and one of them is a little bit dated. There's this book called The Leadership Pipeline, and I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but the core premise, it goes through sort of 6 turns from like managing self to managing others to managing managers and on through kind of how leadership should grow at a company. But the key takeaway for me anyway was fairly early in the book that as you grow through this pipeline, your skills, your work values, and your time applications should change and must change, or else you're going to have a problem later. You're going to basically think like any other pipeline. You're going to gum up the pipeline and stay in the way of people actually continuing to grow. And so the work values thing, you mentioned earlier how great it feels to see that team sort of gel. Mm-hmm. That's a thing that, your dopamine hit starts to come from things like that at some point versus, man, I just added, 1,000 lines of code that were amazing, or better, a better dopamine hit might be I deleted 1,000 lines of code. But even so, at some point it stops being that and it starts being, I just saw something amazing happen with this team. And so that's some stuff that's really interesting. And I'm currently listening to a book that just released called The Team That Managed Itself. And I'm really interested in this one. It's Christina Wutke, I think is how you say the last name. I hope I didn't butcher it. I'm sorry, Christina, if you actually end up listening to this podcast. But she also wrote a book about OKRs that I never thought once in my life I would get excited about a book about OKRs. But the way that it was spelled out, the way that the book spelled it out was so good that I was like, okay, I need to get this next book. Mm-hmm. And it's about this software team for a gaming company that the new GM for the studio is trying to figure out how to organize things, and she's learning lots of lessons as she goes. And so far I'm loving it. There are so many of these sort of principles around like, how do you actually build a team sort of norms? Like, how do you actually get people together and sort of agree about this is how we're going to interact with one another, and how important that is for forming a team that's going to be able to manage. And I tell my team on a regular basis, if I'm doing my job okay, I could go away for a month and things would be fine because you're good at your job. You know what you're doing. You have the support necessary to get the job done. For me, that's a key heuristic. Not to make yourself indispensable, but to make yourself utterly superfluous. And the work product is that bit. The fact that now people can do this without you. And so many leaders, again, it goes back to the optics thing. They want to be front and center, taking all the credit. And that's actually not the job.
I'm curious. It sounds like originally you weren't a big fan of OKRs, and then after reading this book, you're starting to kind of believe it. Tell me more about that. I'd like to get your opinion on the whole OKR thing.
So I feel like she buried the lead in this book. At the very end, I think it was in the afterword of the book or some appendix, there was something that basically said, more or less, you may notice that this seems to differ somewhat from the typical sort of Google-inspired OKR implementation. And she was very kind, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she said, one of the experts that we interviewed was somebody that, worked at Google and did, was well-versed in their OKRs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We still recommend this other way. You're welcome to try. There are many ways to make it work. You're welcome to try that, but this is what we recommend. And I felt like I couldn't figure out why am I loving this so much? Why does it make so much more logical sense in this format than it did in the typical sort of regurgitated OKR process is like, hey, Google has entire pages on this stuff. Let's go digest that and we'll just do that and we can do it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Nobody ever got fired for doing what Google does, And when I get to the end of this book, I'm like, oh, this is why I like it, because it's not the Google one. It's something different. It's subtly different, but importantly different in that it connects to the why do we do these things. And it makes them part of just how we do business, as opposed to focusing so much on the measurement. The measurement's important, but it's bigger than that. And one of the things that she splits it out into is she says, objectives and key results are valuable for different reasons. Objectives are big picture stuff, and they help show vision and inspire people that are motivated by that sort of like ambitious thing. Mm-hmm. Key results help motivate, and I'm paraphrasing, but key results help motivate the kinds of people that want to keep score and see their progress, right? It's a percentage based, it's numbers based, it's measurable in some sense. So the objectives can be inspiration. The key results can say, hey, we're getting there, mm-hmm. right? And they both serve those purposes. And once I heard that, I'm like, oh, I'm all in. Yeah. Like, abso-freaking-lutely.
Because there's a why behind the key results, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you detach people from the why, you are for the people that I want to work with anyway, if you're detaching them from the why, you're cutting them off from electricity, and they're running on battery, and eventually they are going to run dry. Mm-hmm. You absolutely need to keep them plugged into the why, or else they are not going to stay motivated. And those are the people I want on my teams. Yeah. Right? Is that they want the connection to why it matters.
Because then they can innovate. Mm-hmm. If you have somebody who is just happy taking on tasks and executing on tasks, that's fine, but that's not going to help us in building better technology, building better user experience, all of those types of things. So I totally agree with you on that. Ernie, this has been awesome. How can folks get in touch with you and kind of see what you're up to and stay. I know you're giving talk, although it's probably hard right now to give talks, obviously with COVID. At some point that's going to start. What are you planning on being up to, and how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah. So right now, the easiest way to get in touch with me is via Twitter. It's very easy. It's just Ernie Miller on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle. Very difficult. My domain is ernie.io, so you can go there. I have all the previous talks that I've given available there, anything that's been recorded anyway. And I haven't written there in a while. I need to get back to it. Maybe if I say these out loud to the entire internet, they'll happen. I want to write a post about reclaiming manager readmes at some point for good. They're a bit of a controversial topic in leadership circles, and I have a different take than what's been out there. So maybe if I say that now, I'll get there.
You have officially committed now, Ernie. So we'll tweet you every once in a while and say, "Where's that blog post you promised us?"
I also want to write about the values donut, which is the danger of having senior leadership that does really great at kind of casting vision and defining the team values. And the folks on the ground floor, they get it too. They're very excited about that stuff. And then you have that hole in the middle. That hole in the middle where the values alignment isn't there can absolutely debilitate teams. And I want to write a little and talk a little about that soon.
That sounds awesome. Wonderful. We'll make sure we link to all of those resources, including the book recommendations that you made in the show notes. Thank you so much, Ernie. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thanks, Mark. This has been fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Building Better Software Teams podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.